I'm Judy Olian. I'm at UCLA Anderson as the dean, and I'm heading to Quinnipiac. And my panelists that you can read about are on my left, Chris Ye, who is...
I brought my cheering section with me.
Yeah, he's co-founder of Wasabi Ventures and most recently wrote a book called Blitzscaling with Reid Hoffman that is coming out in October.
It is coming out October 9th. You can pre-order it on Amazon now. That's Blitzscaling, Blitzscaling.
Okay. Next to him is Zaina Orbai, who is head of people at Mapbox and was previously at Yelp. And then Daniel Chait, who is CEO and co-founder of Greenhouse, which is an enterprise talent acquisition software platform. And each of them is more elaborated on in the program. And we're waiting on Vivek Ravisankar, who is co-founder and CEO of HackerRank. And if he doesn't arrive, we will fill the time. So you're here to hear about blitzscaling, which is a new term that Chris and Reid coined. And it's applicable to a lot of different enterprises, ones that are going through radical growth or choosing to go through radical growth. And one of the things we'll talk about is how does it also apply, not just in technological IT enterprises, but also in education. So we'll start first with Chris giving us a 3-minute overview of blitzscaling.
Absolutely. And since I actually haven't checked to see, is that Vivek who's just come in? No?
No.
Wasn't sure. Okay. All right. I was hoping. I was like, he was going to sprint onto stage. It was going to be very exciting. So very quickly, let's talk about the phenomenon of blitzscaling. So blitzscaling is something that Reid and I came up with because when you're an author, you come up with a new term so that you can trademark it and make more money. But it is in response to something that was happening in the world. So when we first started thinking about these ideas, it was back in 2015. And what we noticed is that we were entering this sort of unicorn era. There were companies that were growing faster than ever before. And companies like Facebook, for example, had just mushroomed to this enormous size incredibly quickly. And we said, wow, this feels a little different than what's come before. And can we really examine this and figure out what's going on? And the way we ended up defining blitzscaling, and this is the definition we can use for the rest of the panel, is we said that blitzscaling consisted of prioritizing speed over efficiency in an environment of uncertainty. And so it's something that is a little counterintuitive at times because normally in business we learn to try to be as efficient as possible and we learn to try to be as certain as possible. But blitzscaling turns that on its head and says, there are times when it's actually better to be fast than efficient. There's times when you have to go even if you don't know what's going to happen.
And we'll talk about what those conditions are and what those costs might be associated with going faster than actually your organization is supposedly ready. One more thing, Chris. Where did you come up with the term and how does it analogize to the origin of?
So the funny thing is, this is the second book that Reid and I have written together. Our first book was a book called The Alliance, which is all about talent management, very appropriate, and I gave a talk about it earlier today. And one of the things that happened in The Alliance is we have a term called tours of duty, and people said, wow, that seems like a very military term. And we're like, no, actually it's the best term that we can come up with for the concept in the book. Well, here we are in our very next book, and we said, well, how about the term blitzscaling? That's kind of problematic because it comes originally sort of from the term blitzkrieg, which most people remember in a negative way. And so we thought about it again and we said, well, the whole term blitz has been picked up here in popular culture, whether it's in the NFL or talking about the marketing that you do for a blockbuster film, that really ultimately it is still the best term that we could come up with. And we certainly do not intend to endorse warfare or anything like that in using the term, but we do think it is very appropriate because when armies were blitzscaling, including the U.S. Army under Patton, it was about armies that were deciding to proceed without caution to advance as quickly as possible ahead of supply lines if necessary without the certainty of outcome in order to gain that critical objective.
Yeah, and you cite in your book, a McKinsey phrase that says, grow fast or die slow.
Yeah, well, if you think about the context of blitzscaling, it's really because we have so many more markets today that are winner-take-most or winner-take-all markets. And in winner-take-most or winner-take-all markets, really what we say is that Glengarry, Glen Ross rules apply. So who has seen the movie Glengarry, Glen Ross with Alec Baldwin? So in the movie, Alec Baldwin comes in and he says, guess what, salespeople, you're going to have a competition. First prize is?
Cadillac.
Cadillac, yes.
I can do the
Second
whole
prize
monologue.
is?
Set of steak knives.
And third prize is?
You're fired.
So if you take a look
love
at
that
something
movie.
like social networking, consumer social networking, you can say Facebook is first prize, the Cadillac. And then after that, it becomes like Friendster and Orkut and MySpace, and it's like, wow, the Cadillac is really a lot better than those other ones.
So, Zaina and Daniel, whether in your own companies, in the history of your careers, or in client companies, talk about when you've experienced companies that have blitzscaled and what that has looked like. Zaina.
Yeah, sure. So my experience and background over the last, I guess, 10 years has been radically scaling companies. And my blitzscaling experience started at Levi's. And so that was back in 2008 when it was mainly a wholesale business and they were pivoting into retail because real estate had crashed and that was an opportunity for them to go into all these small locations across the US. And so that was my first experience in retail. And then I joined Yelp in 2011. And that was, at the time, just coming about. They were on the path to IPO, 500 employees, 80 million in revenue, and just local to the US. And so my time there over 6 years, by the time I left, we had grown 10x in sort of all folds, 10x in revenues, 10x in employees, locations. And so those 6 years were, I would say just, I experienced a lot and it was great. And so when we started to get out of that blitz scaling mode, I realized that's what I'm made for and what I enjoy most. And so now I'm at Mapbox, which is a mid-stage startup with a few hundred employees that is also in hyper-growth mode. And so I think when we get further along in the conversation, I'm happy to share things that have gone wrong, things that have gone right, and things don't always go right in a hyper-growth mode.
Well, and that's in a sense an expectation because you're making choices about what to tolerate and what not in the interest of growth. Daniel.
Yeah, I think that's right. So from my standpoint, for those of you that don't know, Greenhouse makes recruiting software. We work with companies that are looking to sort of hire quickly and hire well. And so we work with obviously many fast growth companies that I think fit the description. And we recently sort of stepped back and did an analysis across a common pattern of these type of companies because we've had the privilege of working with the people teams at Airbnb and Slack and Pinterest and WeWork and these companies that, to Chris's point, have grown faster than any company in history. And what's really interesting is that in those early days where their brand is exploding and they're everybody's darling, and as the business is really hyperscaling, one thing that they have that most organizations don't have is they have tons of applicants. Everybody wants to work there. And that overwhelming applicant flow can mask a lot of underlying operational issues. And so one of the patterns that we've seen is that when companies truly go through this massive scaling so quickly is, particularly in the people and kind of operation side, is they're often way behind where a similar organization would be. So if you picture a typical, say, 500-person company, they've got people watching after compliance and legal, they've got people running reports and data, they're together, they're with it. When you're a company that's gone from 0 to 500 in like a matter of months, you don't have time to do any of that stuff. And so you look and act much more like a 20-person company than a 500-person company. And for a while, you can get away with it because you have enough applicants to fill all your roles. But it ends up creating a sort of wake of destruction behind it that takes a bit of time and energy to clean up.
Okay, so how many of you are in the education sector, as you would? Yeah, so many of you might be saying, well, these are these tech companies, the Facebooks, the Snaps, the classic high growth tech companies that have gone through this. But there are examples of segments of education institutions that have gone through hypergrowth, especially in the online segments where you've got sudden scale of all of these tens of thousands of people that are taking courses true online, but they do need to be serviced, like an HBX or a Coursera. We've seen Seoul Academy. We've seen education institutions globalize pretty suddenly and create campuses. So the scale up has to happen pretty quickly. So it could be that certain education segments within larger institutions need to do this, though it certainly isn't our typical mode. So back to you, Chris. These organizations that are going through blitzscaling, they're doing it offensively and defensively. Talk about each.
Sure.
And Daniel and Zaina, just chime in terms of what the drivers are.
And I'll also just mention, even at this conference today, I was sitting at lunch with somebody from MIT, and we were talking about how MIT's sort of online course area it had gone from 50 people last year to 150 people this year, and 40 million revenues to 200 million in revenues. Now that's obviously incredible growth. That's blitzscaling growth. The other thing, of course, is that blitzscaling is always a relative term. The whole point is to be faster than the opposition. There's an old saying, if you're out in the woods with your friend and a bear comes upon you, you don't have to outrun the bear, you just have to outrun the other person. So let's talk about offensive and defensive. So one of the examples we use in the book is a classic defensive example. The reason why you blitzscale is because there's competition that's trying to take the stake, trying to take the Cadillac away from you. And in the book, we talk about the example of Airbnb. So you may not realize this, but Airbnb took a long time to get started. It took the founders like 18 months of putting things on their credit cards to get the company off the ground. As they describe it in the book and in other interviews, they funded it with credit cards. And they actually had those little sleeves for baseball cards. And instead of baseball cards, they had credit cards. And they just kept adding more and more and more. And that's how they financed the company. Don't do that. That's a bad way of doing it. And they finally started to work, and they raised a little money. And then that's when they found out that the guys at Rocket Internet in Germany had decided to clone them. So Rocket Internet is this German company. There's these three brothers, the Samwers, and they're billionaires now. And what they do is very simple. They look at what companies are succeeding in the US, they copy them exactly, and then they sell the company they create to the American company. So they did this with a company called CityDeal, which they sold to Groupon. They did this with a company that they sold to eBay, and then they tried to do this again with Airbnb. And in the case of Groupon, they got 10% of Groupon by basically cloning them very quickly and building a European presence. So when they went to Airbnb, they went to Airbnb and said, hey, nice business you got here. Tell you what, you can have our clone of Airbnb for 25% of the company. Now the context here is that at the time, Airbnb was a 40-person company. And Rocket Internet, when they went in, they went big. So they raised $100 million for their Airbnb clone and hired 400 people in 30 days. And then launched in, I think, 10 countries in Europe. Now this is a defensive example, because if you're a travel company and you don't have Europe, sooner or later you're dead. Like that market is absolutely critical. And so Airbnb actually had to raise money themselves and grow their company. And so within a year, they had gone from a 40-person company to a 400-person company, and were operating in 20 countries.
And never bought the other company.
And never bought the other company. And the whole reason was they just couldn't bring themselves to reward the Rocket Internet guys for just like, we're not going to give in to extortionists. We're going to win this one fair and square. And that was a defensive example, and the irony is that Brian Chesky, the founder, will tell you, we scaled a lot faster. In some ways, they did us a favor, even though it didn't look like it at the time, because we were content to grow at this rate, and they made us grow at this rate, which ended up getting us to our destination faster.
Yeah.
An offensive example, here's one that maybe it's a little older, but it's always struck me as a fascinating one. Amazon and the Kindle. So the Kindle was not a defensive response. It was an offensive response. It wasn't like Amazon was terrified of Barnes & Noble's Nook or anything like that. They predated all of them. But they looked at the publishing industry and said, Jeff Bezos, presumably, said, hey, if we controlled the platform by which people read ebooks, that would probably be really good for Amazon. And they spent a gigantic pile of money on the Kindle. And the first version of the Kindle was clunky, and it didn't really work very well, but they kept at it. And today, how many of you have read a book on your Kindle app, not necessarily a Kindle hardware, sometime in the past 30 days? How many people have read something on Kindle? Right. Amazon controls the publishing industry now because of that offensive blitzscaling bet.
So, looking at tech and the trajectory of growth in tech, which is frightening, frankly, in many, many parts of it, can you do anything but blitzscale in the technology world? Go ahead, Daniel.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So, I think there's a couple things that I would say to that. One is, the market, and the other might be the business model. So, Brian just named a number of examples, but these are companies in massive markets of like worldwide travel and online publishing, and so the ability to kind of build your company to the scale where you're the major player in one of these enormous global markets, that's a rare opportunity, and most organizations aren't in there. And you see that a lot in venture-backed businesses where they start out and their VCs are funding them and saying, hey, like, don't worry about efficiency in the early days, worry about growth, which is kind of your definition. And, we'll all kind of hope you get there. And if you don't, like, it's not the VC's problem, it's your problem. And it's hard for these young companies to tell the difference if they're in a big enough market or not, yet, because everyone imagines that the market, like Airbnb, the whole thing was that they created that market that didn't necessarily exist before. So it can be really challenging if you're not in a big enough market. You sort of go ahead and blitzscale when you shouldn't, and I think a lot of those businesses would be well served taking less capital and growing, appropriately to the market that they are in.
I'll get back to you, Chris.
And I'd love to jump in on that too. So at Yelp, Yelp early days, the competitor was City Search. City Search grew as fast as they could across the country, but didn't get traction. Yelp's strategy at the time was they launched San Francisco, LA, New York. They were only in 3 cities for the first 2 or 3 years, built a brand and a name, and then started launching city by city. And so blitzscaling definitely, was kind of, the approach was just different, right? And so you could say, well, Yelp took a more thoughtful approach, but in the end, as competitors, paid attention to Yelp, there was one moment where we were launching 5 countries, every 3 months, right? And so it caught up, but I would say, that is an interesting
But that
time
was a
work.
defensive strategy.
Yes, that was a defensive, but the offensive one was definitely a lot more tempered before they went into blitzscaling mode.
And one of the things that's important to note about blitzscaling, and we didn't coin this term, but almost immediately after we started using it, somebody else did. If you try to blitzscale and it's not the right strategy, you rapidly go into blitzfailing, which means you leave a giant smoking crater in the ground and lose a huge pile of money.
Yeah.
And so when we look at blitzscaling and say, well, when should you blitzscale, you have to look at a number of different factors, and the book covers them. But the most important one...
Give us the Cliff
Oh, you
Note
want me to
version.
give you the Cliff Notes?
The Cliff
Okay.
Note, the Cliff Note version.
So the Cliff Note version is that you look at these 4 different growth factors to determine whether it makes sense. The first is the size of the market, which is, by the way, the future size of the market, because if you look at Uber and you say the market is taxis, that's the wrong thinking, right? You have to think about what the market's going to be. The second is distribution, because ultimately, for any of these companies, you have to find customers somehow, and it's awful hard to go door to door and sell them. The third is the gross margin, because ultimately this is about making money. This is not about just taking as much money from venture capitalists as possible. They eventually want profits and get grumpy if you don't give them to them. And the final one, which is where the Yelp experience is really relevant, is network effects. So with network effects, what often happens is there are powerful local network effects to any sort of 2-sided marketplace. And with Yelp, the key with Yelp is if you get, or Uber or Lyft, if you have a critical mass in a particular market, then you dominate that market. And the idea is not to advance and 30 markets at once and get 5% market share in each, but to pick the 5 markets and get dominant market share in each so that you establish that competitive advantage, which is long lasting.
But what happens if none of those, or not all of those 4 conditions exist, but you have a competitor that is challenging you for your current status and will undermine your current status? Do you still have to overtake that competitor even if the market doesn't look as big or any of the other conditions exist?
So one of the great stories in sports is Muhammad Ali and George Foreman, the Rumble, and I think it's the Rumble in the Jungle.
Yeah.
And the strategy that Muhammad Ali used in that fight was everyone said, you're going to lose. George Foreman is terrifying. He doesn't have a lean, mean grilling machine yet, but he's still, really strong. And what are you going to do? And what Muhammad Ali did in that fight was he adopted what he called the rope-a-dope strategy, which was to let Foreman punch himself out until he was tired, and then come in and knock him out in the final rounds. And if you have a market where you don't have these sort of network effects to create a long-term competitive advantage, you can let that other company punch themselves out. So if you look at the online grocery market, for example, famously, Webvan back in the dot-com era spent like $2 or $3 billion trying to blitzscale online groceries. Meanwhile, there were these other players like Peapod, I can't remember, Fresh Direct, that were sort of growing much more slowly. They let Webvan punch itself out, and they were around long after Webvan was gone.
It's a gamble.
It absolutely is, and that's why you have to know whether or not it's a smart gamble.
Yeah, and I mean, I think the point I would make is like, it sounds exciting, Companies get an article in TechCrunch when you get VC financing, and like the word blitzscaling sounds really fun. It's much more like exciting sounding of a term than long-term sustainable growth, and like healthy EBITDA margins. Like it doesn't get and so I think people can kind of fall into that trap of like they get stars in their eyes that they're starting a business and all the things it might mean, without really an understanding of the kind of fundamentals of like, is this a market that has these characteristics that requires this strategy, or is it a different strategy? So like, I used to run a consulting business, and we started my kitchen table, and a consulting business is not a blitz scaling. We never felt the impetus that like, oh my God, if we don't get there tomorrow, we're dead. It was like, if we don't get there tomorrow, we'll just keep making money and we'll get there the day after, and that's fine. And over the period of 10 years, we built a really nice business, but it was never subject to these dynamics. And so you can do really well there. You can have a lot of impact. You can build a great business, a great brand. You can have all the things that you want out of your time as an entrepreneur, as a leader. But people get very attracted to the glitz and glamour of kind of high-tech scaling stuff. It's not necessarily what everyone.
Can I jump in there? So blitzscaling, obviously there has to be market opportunity, competition, a lot of different pieces. But I do think the mindset in a blitzscaling company, kind of any company can learn from, right? Which is really about constant improvement. It's about iteration. It's about being better tomorrow than you were yesterday, right? Whether it's solving a core problem that you're passionate about or trying to go faster than your competition. And so, and whether that's, you're going from 10 employees to 20 or 20 to 200, it's a mindset that I do think can be adopted really in sort of whatever environment you're in, which is how do you become either faster, better, smarter than what is in place today.
But I think that one of the essential characteristics, which is a cost, is that you deliberately choose to ignore certain things as you blitz scale because you just don't have the bandwidth, you don't have the capacity to attend to everything. So I want to ask you guys, and I'll start with you, Zaina. Are there leadership and human resource costs associated with blitzscaling?
Absolutely. I mean,
and talk about those.
Yeah, I mean, it's a trade-off, right? And so Daniel touched on it. If you are in a place where you have to hire fast, you still have to maintain quality. And so, how do you do that where maybe you have to hire 300 people in the next year where your company is doubling? And so, and it's not that you're going to sacrifice quality, but you are going to, as Chris mentioned, emphasize speed over efficiency. And so there are times that you're going to make mistakes. You're going to put leaders in place that you need to move out of the business very quickly. And so there's a sense of you're not going to get every hire and leader perfect in the company, right? If you were going to hire maybe 5 people in 1 year, you're going to be a lot more thoughtful. If you have to hire 500 people, of course you're going to be thoughtful, but you're going to, not every person is going to be the right fit. And so there has to be a sense of, look, what are those trade-offs, and how do you set up systems and processes and think through transition where you really plan to mitigate risks, right? And plan for when you're going to make mistakes and move through those gracefully. And so and usually it shows up where you put a leader in place and it wasn't the right person for the role, right? And so how do you set it up that person can have a graceful departure without disrupting the entire environment? But that comes with just mitigating for worst case, planning for worst case, but really focusing on the best case.
And Daniel, how do you hire for blitzscaling?
Yeah, so
Other than hire you?
use Greenhouse, whether you're blitzscaling or not. So is everybody familiar with the term technical debt? You know what that means? So basically when programmers are writing code, they often go quickly, they make mistakes, they leave bugs in there. And over time, that accrues as sort of a debt on the ledger that you've built all this product, but someday you're gonna have to go back and fix those bugs and clean up the code and do these things. So in a sense, you can think of this as management debt or culture debt, that as you go through this blitzscaling phase, you're accruing these little problems, we put this person in this role, but they're not quite right for it, or I know that person wants a promotion, but I'm making them do this individual contributor job today because that's what needs to be done today. You've got all these little pieces of debt that are building up inside your organization that has to be reckoned with and reconciled with at some point. Patty McCord wrote about this in her book. So she was the head of people at Netflix when they were famously going through their massive scaling, and she tells this story that they had this big meeting one day where they came to the realization that within 9 months or something, they were going to represent 30% of all the bandwidth in the internet in America. And it was they looked around the room and they were like, that's insane. If we keep growing at the rate we are, literally Netflix is going to be a third of all the internet traffic around. And so she had to go to her head of engineering and have a really difficult conversation and say, listen, if anybody can do this, you can. You're an incredibly talented team, but you can't do it in 9 months. It's not a fair expectation. And so we're going to have to replace you with someone that's more appropriately qualified for the job that we have to do today. And that's, I think, a good example of the compromises that you make, where if you're not in that crazy rush to get everything done now, here's someone that by her own reckoning is super talented, fundamental to the business and the operations. And in most business scenarios, you say, that's a great leader. Let's invest in that person and build a long-term career at the organization. And they were in a position where they didn't move the person out because they couldn't accomplish their business objectives with that person in the role.
And there's one other side of what blitzscaling can do, and that is not service customers or the audience or learners in the way that you expect, because systems are just not in place. It's a bit chaotic. So what happens there? I mean, how do you make the business work with those choices?
Well, again, a lot of this depends on there being that mythical product market fit that you hear people in Silicon Valley talking about. And I think it was best described to me by an analyst at Forrester when he was talking about how people in organizations felt about Dropbox. And he said that the end users in those organizations tell IT, you will get this product from me by prying it out of my cold, dead hands. Now, Dropbox doesn't offer any customer service as far as I can tell, but the product was so good they were willing to overlook it. An example from my co-author, Reid Hoffman's career, is when they were at PayPal, they had, obviously, customers that were growing very rapidly. They were growing 5% a week. And customers get very picky if you lose their money. And if you're a payment system, if something goes wrong, you lose their money. And so the way Reid described it to me is that their office in Palo Alto had an unlisted unlisted number, but people would get that number and they would randomly dial every extension, and when somebody picked up, they would start yelling at them. And so if you went in the PayPal office at this point in time on University Avenue, you could hear phones ringing constantly. Anytime you picked up one of the phones, a customer started screaming.
And so nobody picked up phones.
And so nobody picked up phones for a while, and they had to come up with a solution. So for a while, they just ignored it. And they said, you know what? We're still growing 5% every week. So we're just going to go with that. And eventually their solution was they flew about a third of the company out to Nebraska, and they hired 100 people. They did group interviews, and they hired 100 people in a week, and they put them to work answering the phone calls of the screaming customers. 50% of those people quit within the first 30 days, and so they hired another 100 people. And today PayPal has 5,000 employees in Omaha, Nebraska doing customer service.
Did you want to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I think that's a classic sort of strategy. You know, when you talked about the definition, it's like you're prioritizing speed over efficiency. And like technology is very efficiency and people are not. Yeah. And so one of the classic things that organizations do in this mode is they sort of fill in for the technology gaps with people, you know, with humans doing all the busy work on the back end. And they try to make it seem very kind of like invisible to the end users, but you know, you can just pile folks into rooms, processing the widgets sort of on the back end until you have the time to like invest in the technology and get over that.
So what's clear from this discussion is that this is not an elixir. It's not good for everyone or every time. You either make that choice very deliberately as an offensive or defensive strategy, or that is thrust upon you by virtue of what's happening to you in the marketplace. So let's transition for a moment to education and say, you know, we're very deliberative in education. We do things mostly carefully. We value the interpersonal dynamics that go on in the workplace. I mean, saying, you know, leadership or human resource issues be damned is not something we do in education. How do you see this fitting? When do you see this fitting in education?
So I'm happy to tackle that first if nobody else wants to. So if we look at education, it's all about change, right? Ultimately, blitzscaling and this rapid growth is about creating change. And even if an organization is like my alma mater, Harvard Business School, and is 100 years old and is super traditional.
The Michigan of the East, we call that.
The Michigan of the East, exactly. It's when it sets out to do something innovative and different, like HBX, it has those characteristics. And so within education, I think it's all about what are the key areas of change that need to happen, where we don't necessarily know how to do it yet, but we need to quickly find an answer because the time is ticking.
However, will those consequences, which are almost inevitable when you have such chaotic growth, when you have the processes that are totally left behind, including maybe the educational product itself that is way less than perfect, would that be tolerated in the education sector?
I think you can see it's tolerated in certain elements of the education sector already. Maybe not K through 12 education, which I think is sort of held as sacrosanct, but we see experimentation happening all the time in higher ed and outside of formal education. I saw on the speaker list Ben Nelson of Minerva, who's trying to innovate on higher education and to build an elite university with no...
So experimentation is not the same thing as blitzscaling, though.
So experimentation is not the same as blitzscaling. Blitzscaling comes in when you feel like you have that product market fit. And when you have that product market fit and you want to make sure you're the first person to get to that massive scale, that's where it comes into play.
I do think, though, blitzscaling isn't about chaos and being sloppy. It is about being intentional about the trade-off between speed and efficiency. And so you are saying, I realize it's not going to be perfect, and there's going to be some pain associated with moving now versus 6 months from now, but I'm willing to do so. And so I think sometimes people think blitzscaling, you just, you know, it's sort of like go rogue and the wild, wild west, and maybe it can feel like that, but it actually is very intentional about, you know, what are the trade-offs. And so, and where it goes wrong, like I experienced at Levi's, where we put speed so far over quality that, you know, one of our like payroll systems kind of blew up and we couldn't pay process paychecks for 8,000 employees the day after Thanksgiving because we had pushed the manual process so far and not invested in automation. And in fact, we didn't get speed or quality, and we had to reboot the whole thing. And so that is one example where if you push it that far, then it's going to set you back actually even further than had you sort of paused. And so I would say the companies that are best at blitzscaling, they're actually very intentional about that trade-off and sort of like put some parameters around if we're going to do this, knowing either we don't have enough data or there's some gaps or blind spots and or things aren't fully efficient, here's the trade-off, and therefore we're going to move forward.
Yeah, and I think as well, like every educational institution is under a tremendous amount of pressure to change. I don't think anyone imagines that they can all just keep doing the same thing that's been going on for 1,000 years, and everything will just be fine and dandy. And so you see this in all kinds of different like arms races for fundraising and resources, and changing in like business models to online, and in K through 12, like public and private competition. All these things are happening regardless. And so I do think that in the world of education, folks are, even in corporate education, where you look at the opportunity to drive like learning and development inside an organization, it's like making people sit down and watch training videos ain't working. So what are we going to do about the fact that people need to develop new skills more than ever, and the way that and people's attention span is going down and down? Like, how do you actually grapple with that? So there are a lot of ways in which, just because you're teaching people things, it doesn't mean you have to just sit there and be like a Greek philosopher. Like, you're still subject to lots of chaos and change, and some people are going to get it, and some people are going to be gotten by it.
So I've differentiated between experimentation and blitzscaling, and of course you can have experimentation without necessarily scaling up so radically. Can blitzscale, and you gave a great example on fundraising, because a lot of educational institutions are in an arms race around fundraising, and sometimes they have shorter term goals that they must meet. And this could be an example where that would apply in administrative areas. So does blitzscaling have a temporal end? Could you do that for 6 months and get to where you need to go and then be done and go back to more normal growth?
So it's absolutely the case that no company can blitzscale forever. Just like no company can double in size forever. Eventually, math just goes against you. One of the things that we try to do in the book is to talk about when do you stop blitzscaling, and what are the signs that perhaps you've gone too far. And you see this with companies all the time. They don't pay attention to the early warning signs. One of the things we tell people is, well, for example, look at not just your overall numbers, but the ratio to the number of employees. The reason blitzscaling works ultimately is because while you start off throwing people at the problem, eventually you have to be achieving greater and greater productivity per employee. If your per employee productivity is starting to decline dramatically, that's probably a sign that things are changing. And again, blitzscaling is a response to a changing environment, but it's not a permanent response. When the environment changes again, you may very well need to slow down.
Yeah, I'd agree. Blitzscaling is about value creation, right? And if that is either not working and or slowing down, or you've gotten X% of market share, then you have to rethink your strategy. But it is about value creation, that you're investing to create more value, and there is a trade-off and a ratio there.
Also to your earlier analogy, Chris, like if you've already outrun the other person, like if the bears ate the other guy,
still going,
then you're not subject to that same competitive force, and you can sort of slow down and take your time a little bit.
So maybe the last question. I think the clock is off.
Cool. Let's go all night.
Are we already over? Oh dear.
No, I'm a bit fast, but as the last question. One of the things in education is that we are reticent to change, and it is hard to change from within educational institutions. And how would you introduce into a culture that is not used to moving fast something of a blitzscaling drive? If you call it a drive, how would you do that to make it fit within that culture? Anyone here?
So.
I mean, I can jump in. I think it's, taking a look at your goals and making them a bit more ambitious, right? And saying, hey, our standard isn't going to be this, but we're going to go for this. And maybe you won't get there, but we are definitely going to try. And so there's the, raising the bar of what you think success looks like, and that comes from leaders in the institutions, and then really creating a safety zone that, look, people can try, but they're going to make mistakes, and creating a culture of trust and failure, that failure is okay. And I think a lot of organizations, if you don't have that, it's hard to set ambitious goals where people think those are achievable without failure. And so I think those are the components of, kind of adjusting culturally to get people in the right mindset.
I mean, I think we've seen it. I think you've seen places where, ambitious university administrators have come in and, set really high bars for fundraising and, capital campaigns, and they come in and they raise $1 billion or $4 billion, and then you got to go spend it. And so they womp down a bunch of buildings on a campus and fill them up with professors and students. And that happens, and I'm not necessarily saying it's a good thing. I think it has a lot of drawbacks to society when that happens, but that's certainly a way to get that to happen.
It's a great example. I'll give you an example of a place where that's happened. The University of Oregon just got a gift of $500 million from Phil Knight to build a science campus.
Yes.
That will take blitzscaling.
Yeah, they'll build the campus.
And Phil is not patient.
But say what you want about that, it will build the campus. It'll
Yep.
happen.
Yep.
And then the questions about tuition and affordability and all those things come into play.
And the final thing I'll just add is that something that educational institutions can learn from traditional technology blitzscalers is oftentimes what technology companies do is they rely on entrepreneurs that they've acquired into the company to help them generate that growth. Now, as a college or university, maybe you can't just sort of run around acquiring people, but you can bring in folks who have the experience, right? One of the ways to make cultural change is to bring in people with different experiences and give them that space in which to play. And I think that that's one of the things that can be very successful.
Well, thank you, Daniel, Zaina, Chris, and wishing you successful scaling, whether it's Blitz or more moderate, and perhaps with Chris's book, you'll have a pathway here. Thank you.